Thomas Bennett had exactly 17 minutes to make an impossible choice. Save himself or sacrifice everything to protect 12 kidnapped women he'd never met. The storm was closing in, his radio was dead, and the people he trusted most had just revealed themselves as the enemy. What happened in those final 17 minutes would remain hidden beneath 40 feet of Pacific water for 4 years until Hurricane Elena's fury finally brought the truth to the surface. This is the story of Thomas Bennett, and by the end of this video, you'll understand why the ocean never forgets the truth, even when everyone else does. Before we dive into those final 17 minutes that change everything, let me paint you a picture of who Thomas Bennett really was. Standing on Tower 7 in Clearwater Bay, California, on what would be the last morning of his life, Thomas wasn't just any lifeguard. He was carrying a legacy that stretched back 3 generations. The binoculars in his hands had belonged to his father, and his father before him. 3 generations of Bennetts had protected this stretch of coastline, watching over swimmers, surfers, and anyone who dared to challenge the Pacific's moods. At 28 years old, Thomas was the youngest head lifeguard in Clearwater Bay's history. 6 years of dedicated service, over 40 lives saved, commendations from the Coast Guard and the governor himself. The locals called him the Guardian, a nickname that would become bitterly ironic in the years to come. But what made Thomas truly special wasn't his swimming ability or his quick reflexes. It was his moral compass, an unshakable belief that protecting the innocent was worth any personal cost. This belief system would ultimately lead him into the darkest conspiracy imaginable. For 3 months before September 14, 2019, Thomas had been carrying a secret so dangerous that it made him question everything he thought he knew about the place he'd sworn to protect. A secret that involved people he'd known since childhood, people who'd been like family to him. It began with lights on the water. Thomas had always been a night owl, often taking walks along the beach after his shifts ended. He knew the rhythms of his coastline better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. But in June 2019, Thomas started noticing something that didn't fit any pattern he recognized. Boats offshore, running without proper navigation signals, moving in formations that made no sense for fishing or recreation. At first, he thought smugglers' drug runners weren't uncommon along the California coast. But then Thomas started paying closer attention, and what he saw made him realize this was something much more sinister. The boats always appeared on moonless nights, usually between 2 and 4 a.m. They would appear from the southwest, moving in a staggered line toward shore. But here's what was strange. They never came all the way to the beach. Instead, they would stop about a quarter-mile offshore. From his vantage point, Thomas could see smaller boats launching from the larger vessels. These smaller craft would disappear for 30 to 40 minutes, then return. After the smaller boats were retrieved, the entire flotilla would vanish back into the darkness. This pattern repeated every 10 to 14 days, always during Thomas's night patrols, almost as if someone knew his schedule. During his day shifts, Thomas started noticing other anomalies. Unfamiliar faces around the marina men in expensive suits who clearly weren't locals. Cars with out-of-state plates parked near the old pier. Most disturbing of all were the young women Thomas occasionally glimpsed near the waterfront. They appeared to be in their late teens or early 20s, but something about them was deeply wrong. They moved like people in shock, their eyes vacant and fearful. When Thomas tried to approach these women, they would react with pure terror. What Thomas discovered next would reveal why these women were so terrified, and it would prove that the very people he should have turned to for help were the ones orchestrating the horror he'd stumbled upon. The breakthrough that changed everything came on August 15, 2019, during what should have been a routine rescue training exercise. Thomas was leading junior lifeguards through deep water rescue scenarios when his primary air regulator malfunctioned at 30 feet. With his backup air supply giving him a few extra minutes, Thomas decided to investigate an unusual rock formation he'd noticed during previous dives. What looked like it might be a small cave system. What Thomas found when he swam into that partially submerged cave changed his understanding of evil forever. The cave was larger than it appeared from the outside, extending back into the cliff face for nearly 50 feet. It was accessible only at low tide, when the entrance was just barely above water level. At high tide, the entire opening would be submerged, making it invisible from the surface. Makeshift beds lined the cave walls. thin mattresses on wooden pallets, arranged in 2 rows of 6. Chains and shackles were bolted directly into the rock walls. The cave floor was littered with personal belongings, jewelry that looked like family heirlooms, photographs of families and children, clothes in sizes that suggested very young women. Thomas found evidence that people had been held here recently, very recently. Food containers that weren't completely empty, blankets that still held body warmth, fresh scratches in the rock walls where someone had tried to chip away at their restraints. Using his underwater camera, Thomas documented everything. As he photographed the evidence, Thomas began to understand the full scope of what he'd discovered. This wasn't just a temporary holding area. It was a sophisticated operation designed to house human cargo for extended periods. But Thomas's discovery was about to take an even darker turn. Hidden behind a loose rock near the back of the cave, Thomas found a waterproof container filled with documents that would reveal the true scope of the operation he'd stumbled upon. Documents that proved this wasn't the work of faceless criminals from far away. The documents Thomas found painted a picture of corruption so vast that it shook his faith in everything he'd believed about his community. Financial records showing payments from offshore accounts to local officials, shipping manifests disguised as fishing boat supplies. Most damning of all, a detailed schedule of deliveries and transfers. But it was the names on those documents that broke Thomas's heart. Police Chief Robert Hayes, the man who had taught Thomas to fish, who had thrown him birthday parties, who had been like a second father to him. Hayes wasn't just aware of the trafficking operation. He was one of its primary coordinators. Mayor Patricia Downs, who had personally presented Thomas with his lifeguard certification. She was listed as receiving monthly payments of $50,000 for municipal cooperation. Harbor Master Carl Vega, who had taught Thomas to read weather patterns and ocean currents, who had saved Thomas's life during a training accident. Vega was providing safe harbor and fuel to the trafficking vessels. The corruption reached into every level of local government. Judge Martinez was making legal problems disappear for $25,000 per case. 3 Coast Guard personnel were on the payroll. Even Dr. Sarah Coleman, the town's beloved pediatrician, was providing medical care and sedatives for the victims. Thomas spent hours in that cave, photographing every document, memorizing every detail. When he finally surfaced, he was no longer the same person who had descended. The innocent trust he'd placed in his community leaders was gone. But Thomas wasn't naive enough to think he could simply turn to the next level of authority. If the corruption reached this deep, how could he know who else might be involved? What Thomas did next would make him one of the most effective undercover investigators in the history of human trafficking cases, even though he had no formal training. But his investigation would also put him on a collision course with the most dangerous people in town. For the next 3 weeks, Thomas Bennett became 2 people. During the day, he was the same dedicated lifeguard he'd always been. But at night, he transformed into a one-man intelligence operation, determined to expose the darkness that had infected his hometown. Thomas's first challenge was documenting the trafficking operation without alerting his targets. He knew that many of the conspirators had known him since childhood. They would recognize him instantly if he got too close. So Thomas got creative. Using his legitimate authority as head lifeguard, Thomas began expanding his patrol routes to include areas he'd never officially monitored before. He requisitioned night vision binoculars and underwater cameras, justifying the expenses necessary for emergency response preparedness. Most ingeniously, Thomas began a fake romance with Jessica Martinez, a marine biology graduate student conducting research in Clearwater Bay. Jessica was completely innocent, but her presence gave Thomas perfect cover for late-night beach activities. Night after night, Thomas and Jessica would set up research stations at various points along the coastline. In reality, Thomas was photographing and recording everything related to the trafficking operation, while Jessica collected her legitimate scientific data, completely unaware of the real purpose. Through careful surveillance, Thomas began to piece together the full scope of the operation. The trafficking network operated on a precise schedule, with deliveries every 10 to 14 days. Each shipment contained between 8 and 15 young women. The women were brought in on fishing boats modified with hidden compartments. During the day, these vessels operated as legitimate fishing boats. At night, they would rendezvous with larger ships 50 miles offshore, taking on their human cargo. Once the women reached the sea cave, they would be held for anywhere from 3 days to 2 weeks. The cave wasn't just a holding facility, it was a processing center. The women's identities were completely erased. Any identification documents were destroyed. Their hair was cut and dyed, and they were given new clothes. Most horrifically, the women were subjected to what the documents called conditioning, psychological breaking designed to make them completely submissive. Thomas documented everything, but with each revelation, his anger grew. These weren't just criminals, they were people he'd loved and trusted, systematically destroying innocent lives for profit. 3 weeks into his investigation, Thomas made a discovery that changed everything. While reviewing financial records, Thomas found evidence that the trafficking operation had been responsible for a case that had haunted him for 5 years. In 2014, a young woman named Elena Vasquez had disappeared from Clearwater Bay under mysterious circumstances. Elena had been vacationing with her family from Mexico City, celebrating her quinceañera. Elena was last seen walking along the beach at sunset. When she didn't return, her family contacted police. Chief Hayes personally handled the case, assuring the family that everything possible was being done. The official investigation concluded that Elena had likely been swept out to sea. Her body was never found, and after 2 weeks, the case was closed. The Vasquez family returned to Mexico heartbroken, but trusting that American authorities had done everything they could. Thomas had participated in the search efforts, spending days diving in dangerous waters. He'd been devastated when Elena's body was never recovered, taking her disappearance as a personal failure. Now, 5 years later, Thomas found Elena's name in the trafficking documents. She hadn't drowned. She'd been taken, processed through the same sea cave, and sold to buyers in Nevada. Elena had been one of the operation's early victims. Chief Hayes hadn't failed to find Elena Vasquez. He had deliberately covered up her kidnapping while her family begged for help. But Elena's case wasn't isolated. Thomas found records of 6 other missing persons cases over 5 years, all involving young women, all dismissed as drownings or runaways. Each case had been handled personally by Hayes, and each victim's name appeared in the trafficking documents. The scope was far larger than Thomas had realized. This was a systematic criminal enterprise that had been operating for years, with authorities not just turning a blind eye, but actively facilitating the disappearances. Thomas made a decision that night that would seal his fate. He couldn't wait any longer to involve federal authorities, but first he needed insurance. What Thomas did next showed why he truly deserved the title guardian. Knowing that he might not survive what he was planning, Thomas created an insurance policy that would ensure the truth is survived even if he didn't. Thomas knew his investigation had reached the point where further delay would only increase danger to current victims. But he also understood that his evidence might not be enough to guarantee convictions if corrupt officials had ways of making evidence disappear. So Thomas created what he called his insurance policy, a comprehensive documentation package that would be impossible to suppress. First, Thomas made multiple copies of every piece of evidence, storing them in different locations around Clearwater Bay. One set went into a safety deposit box in a bank 3 towns over. Another set was hidden in the lighthouse where his grandfather had once worked. Most ingeniously, Thomas created a time-delayed revelation system. He recorded detailed video testimonies explaining everything he'd discovered, including specific details about the trafficking operation, the identities of all conspirators, and the exact location of the sea cave. These videos were scheduled to be automatically uploaded to social media and sent to news organizations if Thomas failed to check in every 48 hours. Thomas also reached out to FBI agent Lisa Chen, part of a federal task force investigating trafficking along the West Coast. But Thomas was careful, scheduling a meeting for September 15th at a location 50 miles inland, far from any potential surveillance. This would give Thomas time to complete one final piece of his investigation: direct contact with the current victims. He had observed that a new shipment of women had arrived on September 12th. Based on the pattern he'd documented, they would be held for approximately 1 week before being moved. But as Thomas finalized his plans, he began noticing signs that his investigation might have been discovered. Small things at first. Equipment moved slightly. his computer showing signs of unauthorized access, unfamiliar faces watching him during patrols. Most troubling, Thomas noticed increased boat activity around the cave area during daylight hours. Someone was checking on the security of their operation. Thomas realized his time was running out. On September 13th, Thomas made his final preparations. He updated his insurance system with additional evidence and recorded what he expected would be his final video testimony. "If you're watching this," Thomas said into the camera, "it means I didn't make it out alive. But maybe my death will mean something if it saves those women and exposes the evil hiding in our community." He had no idea that his enemies were already moving against him. At 6:47 a.m. on September 14, 2019, Thomas Bennett received a text message that would force him to abandon all his careful plans and plunge headfirst into the most dangerous situation of his life. The text message came from an untraceable number. "Cave, 1 hour, come alone, or the women die." Thomas had no doubt about who had sent it. The only people who knew about the cave's use were the traffickers themselves. His investigation had been discovered, and now his enemies were forcing a confrontation on their terms. Thomas's first instinct was to contact Agent Chen, but a second message arrived. "We have eyes on you. Phone calls equals dead women. You have 58 minutes." Thomas understood the threat. His enemies were watching closely enough to know if he tried to involve outside help. Any attempt to bring federal agents would result in the immediate execution of the 12 women in the cave. But Thomas also understood this was almost certainly a trap designed to eliminate both him and the witnesses. The traffickers couldn't allow the women to live because their testimony would bring down the entire network. They also couldn't allow Thomas to live. The plan was probably simple: lure Thomas to the cave, kill him along with the 12 women, then claim that a heroic lifeguard had died trying to rescue illegal immigrants trapped during Hurricane Elena's approach. The story would be tragic but believable. Thomas had less than an hour to figure out how to save 12 lives while walking directly into a death trap. As he gathered his diving gear, Thomas's mind raced through possible strategies. He could try to approach from an unexpected direction, using his knowledge of underwater currents. He could attempt to document everything, hoping his evidence would survive. But Thomas kept coming back to one fact: 12 innocent women were about to be murdered unless he acted. Even if saving them cost his life, those 12 women deserved a chance to live. Thomas made one final update to his insurance system, uploading the threatening text messages. If he didn't survive the next few hours, at least the truth would eventually come to light. The swim to the cave was treacherous due to Hurricane Elena's approaching influence. Waves were unpredictable and dangerous, and underwater currents were shifting in ways Thomas had never experienced. But Thomas had been swimming these waters his entire life. Even under the worst conditions, he could navigate to the cave by instinct alone. What Thomas found inside exceeded his worst expectations. The 12 women were chained to the walls like animals, most barely conscious from sedatives. But Thomas wasn't alone in the cave. 3 figures emerged from the shadows, 3 men he had loved and trusted his entire life, now revealed as monsters. "Right on time, Guardian," Police Chief Hayes said, his voice carrying genuine sadness. "We really hoped you'd mind your own business, Tommy. Your dad was a good man. Never caused us any trouble." Deputy Morrison stepped forward, his service weapon drawn. "The women get good homes, Tommy. Better than whatever hellhole they came from. Rich families who take care of them." The euphemisms made Thomas physically sick. He understood exactly what good homes really meant. Harbor Master Vega spoke with apparent regret. "Your father never would have caused this kind of trouble, son." David understood that sometimes good people have to make compromises. "My father never knew about this," Thomas said. Hayes shook his head sadly. "David suspected something, Tommy. Why do you think he had that heart attack? Sometimes the stress of keeping secrets can be overwhelming." The implication hit Thomas like a physical blow. His father's death hadn't been natural. "You killed him," Thomas whispered. "We didn't have to," Morrison replied. "The truth was enough to stop his heart." Thomas looked at the women chained to the walls. Most couldn't understand English, but they could read his face. They knew their fate depended on what happened next. Through the cave entrance, Thomas could see the water level rising, with the incoming tide and approaching hurricane. Soon the passage would be underwater, trapping everyone inside. You're not planning to evacuate before the hurricane, Thomas realized. Hayes shrugged. Market's getting too hot anyway. Time to lay low. These girls have become a liability. And me? You're going to be a hero, Tommy, Morrison said mockingly. Died trying to save illegal immigrants trapped in a sea cave during Hurricane Elena. Tragic loss. Your mother will be so proud. Thomas understood their plan. They would let the cave flood naturally, drowning everyone inside while they waited safely with perfect alibis. The hurricane would destroy forensic evidence, and the heroic lifeguard story would be believable. But Thomas knew something about the cave structure that his captors didn't. How long has this been going on? Thomas asked, playing for time. 3 years, Hayes admitted. Started small, but the money... You have no idea how much these people will pay for fresh merchandise. The scope of corruption was staggering, but Thomas was running out of time. The water was rising, and soon everyone would be trapped. That's when Thomas made his decision. What Thomas did next would demonstrate why he truly deserved the title Guardian. But it would also cost him everything he held dear. In those final 17 minutes, Thomas Bennett would prove that sometimes one person's courage can change everything. I planted explosives in your boats, Thomas lied smoothly, buying precious time. Dead man's switch. If I don't check in every hour, your entire fleet goes up. It was a desperate bluff, but Morrison's gun wavered slightly. These men had invested hundreds of thousands in their floating assets. You're lying, Hayes said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. Thomas was buying time, but for what? The water was rising fast. Soon even he wouldn't be able to swim out through the passage. Then he saw it. A loose rock near the cave's rear wall, where decades of water erosion had weakened the structure. If he could create a collapse in just the right spot, Thomas slowly reached into his diving gear, pretending to fumble for a detonator that didn't exist. Instead, his fingers found his emergency air tank, a small bottle with enough compressed air for 5 minutes underwater. Don't be stupid, Tommy, Hayes warned. There's nowhere to run. Thomas smiled sadly. I'm not running. He triggered the emergency release on his air tank and hurled it at the weak spot in the cave wall. The explosion wasn't large, but in the confined space, amplified by water and rock, it was enough. The cave ceiling cracked. Water began pouring in from above as the structure collapsed, but not the way Thomas had hoped. Instead of creating an escape route, the explosion had destabilized the entire chamber. Hayes and Morrison scrambled for the entrance as tons of rock and seawater crashed down. Morrison's gun went off in the chaos, the bullet ricocheting before striking Thomas in the shoulder. Thomas ignored the pain and dove toward the chained women. With his diving knife, he began cutting through their restraints as the cave flooded around them. Most were too weak from drugs to swim, but terror gave them strength. Follow me, he shouted in English, then repeated it in Spanish and what little Mandarin he knew. Hold hands. Stay together. The water was chest deep now and rising fast. Hayes and Morrison had disappeared through the entrance, but Vega lay motionless under a fallen boulder. Thomas knew the truth even as he worked to free the last woman. The entrance passage was already underwater. Even a strong swimmer would struggle to make it out. For weakened captives, it was impossible. But there was another way. Thomas's diving gear included an emergency explosive charge designed to blow through underwater obstacles. If he could position it correctly against the cave's rear wall, where he'd seen fissures, he might be able to blast through to the ocean on the other side. The explosive required manual detonation. Someone had to stay behind and trigger it at exactly the right moment, when the women were clear but close enough to escape the cave's collapse. Thomas gathered the 12 women around him in the rising water. Using hand gestures and simple words, he managed to communicate the plan. When the explosion came, they had to swim toward the light. No matter what happened, they had to keep swimming up. The water was at their necks now. In minutes, the cave would be completely flooded. Thomas positioned the explosive charge and activated the timer. 60 seconds. He helped the first woman into the water, supporting her as she struggled to swim. Then the second, the third. His wounded shoulder screamed with pain, but he kept going. 45 seconds. The women were in the water now, clinging to each other and debris. Thomas swam with them toward the rear of the cave, where he hoped the explosion would create their escape route. 30 seconds. Swim, Thomas shouted. Swim to the light. 20 seconds. Thomas positioned himself between the women and the explosive. If the blast was too powerful, if the debris field was too wide, he would absorb the impact. They would have their chance. 10 seconds. The last thing Thomas Bennett saw was light not from the explosion, but from above. Sunlight filtering down through 40 feet of water, showing the women which way was up, which way was life. The explosion tore through the cave like an angry fist. 11 women reached the surface alive. Thomas Bennett's body was never found. The official investigation concluded that Thomas Bennett had died attempting to rescue illegal immigrants trapped during Hurricane Elena. Chief Hayes and Deputy Morrison corroborated this story, claiming they'd tried to stop Bennett from making the dangerous rescue attempt. The trafficking investigation quietly disappeared. The 11 survivors were deported after brief questioning, their testimony dismissed as confused memories. Hayes was promoted to county sheriff. Morrison became police chief. Thomas was posthumously awarded the Coast Guard's Gold Life-Saving Medal. A statue was erected in the town square. Thomas Bennett, he gave his life for others. But they called him a coward anyway. The official story, spread through whispers, was that Bennett had abandoned his post during the hurricane. Some suggested he'd been involved in trafficking himself. Thomas's mother, Helen Bennett, fought these rumors for 3 years before her heart gave out. She died believing her son had been falsely accused, never knowing the truth of his heroism. For 4 years, the truth lay buried beneath 40 feet of Pacific water. But the ocean remembers everything. Hurricane Elena returned to California waters in September 2023, 4 years to the day after Thomas's disappearance. This time, Elena brought fury that reshaped the coastline. Waves over 60 feet high scoured the ocean floor. Marine archaeologist Dr. Sarah Mitchell was part of the post-storm survey team. On October 3, 2023, her sonar detected an anomaly, a large cavity exposed by the hurricane's impact. What Dr. Mitchell found when she descended would rewrite history and expose the conspiracy that had corrupted an entire town. The sea cave had been split open, its contents scattered across the ocean floor. Among the debris, Mitchell found human remains still wearing a lifeguard's uniform. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was a waterproof case, sealed and intact for 4 years, containing hundreds of photographs, documents, and recorded testimonies that proved Thomas Bennett hadn't been a coward or criminal. He'd been an undercover investigator who died exposing one of the largest human trafficking networks in California history. Dr. Mitchell immediately contacted the FBI. This time, the investigation couldn't be buried. Too many people had seen the evidence. The federal task force that assembled was the largest anti-trafficking operation in California history. Using Thomas's evidence as a roadmap, they unraveled a network that had operated for over a decade. Robert Hayes was arrested at his home while eating breakfast with his grandchildren. Morrison was taken into custody at the police station. Mayor Downs was found dead in her car in apparent suicide. Judge Martinez was arrested for obstruction. 3 Coast Guard personnel were charged with conspiracy. Dozens of prominent citizens faced federal indictments. Most importantly, the investigation led to the rescue of hundreds of trafficking victims across 3 states. Women sold into slavery were freed. Children stolen from families were reunited with relatives. But vindication came too late for Helen Bennett, who died still believing her son had been unfairly maligned. On September 14, 2024, a memorial service was held where the sea cave had once hidden its terrible secrets. 11 women attended. The survivors Thomas had died to save. Maria Santos, who'd been 19 when Thomas saved her, spoke for the group. For 4 years, we thought no one would ever know what he did for us. We thought the world would remember him as a criminal, not a hero, but the ocean remembered. The truth always finds a way to surface. Thomas Bennett's body was finally recovered in March 2025, when shifting currents revealed the underwater chamber where he'd made his final stand. The discovery came during a routine marine survey, 8 months after the truth about his heroism had finally been exposed. For over 5 years, Thomas had been resting in that underwater tomb, surrounded by the remnants of his final battle against evil. The recovery operation was led by the same team that had originally found his evidence. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the marine archaeologist who had uncovered the truth, personally supervised the delicate process of bringing Thomas home. When they found him, he was still positioned exactly as he had been in those final moments, between the explosive device and where the 12 women had been swimming toward freedom. Even in death, he was still protecting them, Dr. Mitchell later wrote in her report. His body bore the full impact of the blast and debris, creating a shield that had given those women the precious seconds they needed to escape. Thomas Bennett was buried with full military honors in Clearwater Bay Cemetery, his grave positioned on a hill overlooking the ocean he had died protecting. The ceremony was attended by hundreds of people, including federal agents, Coast Guard personnel, trafficking survivors from across the country, and citizens who had finally learned the truth about their fallen guardian. But perhaps the most moving moment came when 12 women stepped forward to place flowers on his grave. These were the survivors, 11 who had escaped that underwater hell, and one represented by her sister, who had traveled from Guatemala to honor the man who had tried to save them all. Maria Santos, now 23 and a nursing student in Oregon, spoke for the group. Her English had improved dramatically in the years since her rescue, but her voice still carried the weight of what she had endured. For 4 years, we lived with the knowledge that a hero had died for us, but the world thought he was a coward. We carried his memory in our hearts, but we couldn't speak his name without people looking at us with suspicion. We were told we were confused, that our memories were unreliable, that the man who saved us was actually a criminal. She paused, tears streaming down her face as she looked out over the ocean where Thomas had made his final stand. But we knew the truth. We saw his face in those last moments. We saw him choose our lives over his own. We saw him position himself between us and death itself. And we promised each other that someday, somehow, the world would know what Thomas Bennett really was. The ceremony established more than just Thomas's final resting place. It marked the beginning of a new chapter in the fight against human trafficking, inspired by the methods and courage that Thomas had demonstrated in his final investigation. The Thomas Bennett Foundation for Human Trafficking Prevention was officially launched that day, funded by seizures from the criminal network his evidence had helped dismantle. The Foundation's mission goes beyond rescue and rehabilitation. It focuses on training law enforcement officers to recognize and investigate trafficking operations, particularly in small communities where corruption can take root. Thomas showed us that you don't need federal authority or specialized training to make a difference, said FBI agent Lisa Chen, who had been scheduled to meet with Thomas on the day he died. You just need the courage to see evil for what it is and the determination to do something about it, even when the cost is everything you hold dear. The Foundation also established the Guardian Protocol, a new standard for investigating suspected trafficking operations in coastal communities. The protocol is based directly on Thomas's methodical approach to gathering evidence and his innovative use of legitimate activities to cover surveillance operations. Perhaps most importantly, the Foundation created a secure reporting system for potential trafficking victims and witnesses. The system was designed to bypass local authorities entirely, connecting directly with federal task forces, a safeguard that might have saved Thomas's life if it had existed during his investigation. But Thomas's legacy extends far beyond law enforcement procedures and institutional changes. His story has become a powerful reminder of what individual courage can accomplish, even in the face of overwhelming corruption and danger. In the years following the exposure of the Clearwater Bay trafficking network, similar investigations were launched in dozens of other coastal communities. Thomas's evidence had revealed connections that stretched across state lines, leading to the identification and dismantling of trafficking operations from Oregon to Mexico. The methods he pioneered using legitimate activities as cover for surveillance, creating multiple evidence caches, establishing time-delayed revelation systems are now taught at federal law enforcement academies across the country. His approach to documentation has been credited with making trafficking cases more successful in court, where his detailed photographic and financial evidence became the gold standard for prosecution. Dr. Sarah Coleman, the pediatrician who had been part of the trafficking conspiracy, was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Before her sentencing, she was asked if she had any remorse for her actions. "I think about those women every day," she said, "but mostly I think about Thomas Bennett. I delivered that boy when he was born. I treated his scraped knees and broken bones. I watched him grow into the kind of man who would sacrifice everything to save strangers, and I betrayed him in the worst possible way. The statue in Clearwater Bay's town square was rededicated with a new inscription that tells the full truth. Thomas Bennett, he chose truth over safety, others over self, justice over silence. Below the inscription, a plaque lists the names of the 11 women he saved, along with Elena Vasquez and the other victims whose disappearances he had uncovered. But perhaps the most fitting memorial isn't made of bronze or marble. It's the lives that continue because of Thomas's sacrifice. Maria Santos graduated from nursing school and now works in a clinic that specializes in treating trafficking survivors. She keeps a photo of Thomas on her desk, not the official Coast Guard portrait, but a candid shot taken during one of his beach safety seminars, where he's teaching children to swim. He taught all of us that safety comes from preparation and courage, she explains to patients who ask about the photo. I became a nurse because Thomas showed me that protecting others is the highest calling anyone can have. Two of the other survivors have started their own foundation, working specifically with Spanish-speaking trafficking victims. Three others have become U.S. citizens and work in various forms of victim advocacy. One became a federal agent herself, inspired by Thomas's example of using legitimate authority to fight injustice. Even Carmen Flores, the one survivor who didn't make it out of the cave alive, has a legacy connected to Thomas's sacrifice. Her family in Honduras received her remains and was able to give her a proper burial, something that would never have been possible if Thomas hadn't exposed the trafficking network. A school in her village was renamed in her honor, and a scholarship fund helps other young women pursue education instead of falling victim to traffickers. The story of Thomas Bennett teaches us that heroism isn't about superhuman strength or fearless bravery. It's about ordinary people making extraordinary choices when confronted with injustice. It's about understanding that some things are worth dying for, and that truth, once revealed, has the power to change everything. Thomas was terrified during those final 17 minutes in the cave. He knew he was probably going to die. He knew that his sacrifice might be in vain, that the corrupt officials might successfully cover up his death and continue their crimes. But he also knew that 12 innocent women deserved a chance at freedom and that their lives were worth the risk. The ocean remembers everything, even when we forget. It remembered Thomas's courage long after the world had dismissed him as a coward. It preserved his evidence when human institutions failed, and it finally surrendered his body when the truth could no longer be suppressed. Today, when Coast Guard recruits take their oath of service, they learn about Thomas Bennett. When lifeguards complete their training, they hear his story. When federal agents investigate trafficking cases, they use methods he pioneered. But Thomas's greatest legacy isn't institutional or procedural. It's personal. It's the reminder that in a world where corruption seems overwhelming, where evil seems to have all the advantages, one person's willingness to stand up can make all the difference. The Guardian is finally home. The truth has finally surfaced. And 12 women are alive today because one man chose to do the right thing, even when it cost him everything. What would you do with 17 minutes to save 12 lives? Thomas Bennett showed us the answer. Sometimes the greatest victory comes from the ultimate sacrifice. Sometimes dying for what's right is the only way to truly live. If this story has moved you, if Thomas's courage has inspired you, remember to subscribe and share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that heroes are real, that truth always finds a way to surface, and that individual courage can change the world. The ocean remembers, and so should we, because the next time someone needs a guardian, it might be up to one of us to answer the call.